Hello. My wife ended up pregnant even though I'm infertile. When I questioned it, she replied, maybe if you had real faith, you wouldn't doubt God's gifts. So I exposed the truth, and everything in her life fell apart. My name is James. I am 36 and I work as a delivery driver in Washington. Most of my days are simple and predictable. I spend hours on the road moving packages between warehouses and stores, usually starting early in the morning and finishing sometime in the afternoon. My wife is Rachel. She is 34 and works as a nail master at a small salon about 15 minutes from our apartment. We have been married for 6 years and living together almost the entire time. No kids. At least that was always the understanding after the medical news we received. About 4 years ago, I went through a long series of medical tests after we had been trying without success. The results were clear and not really open to interpretation. I am infertile. The doctor walked me through the reports and the numbers in a calm way. The chances were extremely close to zero. Rachel reacted in a way that confused me back then. Instead of getting angry or sad, she leaned heavily into religion. She started attending church several times a week. Then came prayer groups and Bible studies. I never tried to stop her. People deal with disappointment in different ways, and faith seemed like a harmless outlet. What did change was the way she talked to people, especially me. Rachel had always been a little sharp, but over time it turned into constant lectures about belief and moral weakness. If someone lost their job, it was because they lacked faith. If something went wrong at home, it was because I was not spiritual enough. Then about a month ago, she walked into the apartment after work and calmly told me she was pregnant. At first, I thought she was joking. When I realized she was serious, I reminded her about the diagnosis from years ago. I expected confusion or maybe fear. Instead, she looked at me like I had just offended her and said that maybe if I had real faith, I would not question a gift from God. That was the moment my brain stopped accepting the situation as normal. Because faith can explain many things, but it does not rewrite medical records. I did not argue with her that night. I have spent enough years driving routes to know when someone is not interested in a real conversation. Rachel had already decided what the explanation was, and anything I said would just turn into another lecture about belief. She stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, and that tight expression she gets when she thinks she is morally superior to everyone else. She kept repeating that miracles happen all the time and that only weak people question them. According to her, my problem was that I trusted doctors more than God. I did not raise my voice. I simply reminded her of one detail. Medical infertility is not the same as just having low chances. The doctor had explained it clearly years ago. I had multiple tests done over several months. The results were consistent every time. There were no swimmers. Not low numbers. None. Rachel immediately brushed that off and said doctors are wrong all the time. Then she said something that stuck with me. She told me that doubt itself is a sin and that questioning the pregnancy showed how spiritually broken I was. That was when I stopped trying to debate the topic. Instead, I asked one practical question. When exactly did you find out? She said she had taken 2 tests earlier that week, and both were positive. According to her, she had already scheduled a doctor appointment for confirmation. The way she said it was strange. Not nervous. Not surprised. More like someone announcing good news they had been waiting to deliver. I asked if she had told anyone else. She said yes. Her church group already knew and they were praying for us. She said the pastor called it a sign that God rewards faithful wives even when husbands struggle with belief. That comment was not accidental. She looked directly at me when she said it. I nodded and told her we would talk more after the doctor confirmed everything. What I did not tell her was that I had already decided something that night. I was not going to argue about faith. I was going to check facts. The next morning, I started handling the situation the same way I deal with problems at work. One step at a time. No drama. Just facts. Rachel spent most of the week acting like nothing unusual was happening. If anything, she seemed pleased with herself. She talked constantly about the pregnancy like it was already proven to be some kind of miracle story. Every time I tried to bring up practical questions, she shut it down the same way. Faith. God's plan. Miracles happen to those who believe. After hearing the same speech 3 or 4 times, I stopped debating it completely. Instead, I waited for the one thing that actually mattered. Medical confirmation. Her doctor appointment happened the following Tuesday. Rachel came home smiling like she had just won something. Pregnancy confirmed. According to the doctor, she was about 6 weeks along. Rachel immediately launched into another speech about how this proved everything she had been saying. She told me maybe this would finally fix my lack of faith. I listened quietly and nodded. Then I said something very simple. If this is real, there is an easy way to prove it. A paternity test. The reaction was instant. Rachel's entire mood flipped like a switch. She looked offended in that dramatic way she uses when she wants to play the victim. She said it was disgusting that I would accuse my own wife of cheating. I explained that I was not accusing anyone. I was simply asking for the same confirmation any rational person would ask for when the situation contradicts medical reality. She went right back to religion. She said asking for a paternity test was the same as doubting God. According to her, if I had real faith, I would accept the pregnancy without questioning it. That argument might work on people from her church group. It does not work on someone who has seen his own medical records. I told her calmly that if the pregnancy was truly some miracle, then the test would only prove it. For a moment, she just stared at me. Then she said something interesting. Fine, we can do the test. Rachel agreed to the test much faster than I expected. That alone made me suspicious. A person who truly believes they are right usually argues longer. Rachel normally loves long arguments, especially when she can frame them as moral lessons. This time she ended the discussion almost immediately. She crossed her arms and said if a test was what I needed to calm my weak faith, then we could do it. But she added one condition. We would tell people about it after the results came back, so they could see how wrong I was for doubting her. That comment told me a lot about her mindset. Rachel was already imagining the story she wanted to tell. In her version, I would look foolish, and she would look like the faithful wife whose miracle baby proved everything. I simply said fine. The test itself was not complicated. There are clinics around Washington that handle prenatal paternity testing early in pregnancy. It is not cheap, but the process is straightforward. Rachel came with me to the appointment a few days later. The nurse explained the procedure and took blood samples from both of us. Rachel spent most of the visit acting irritated, like the whole thing was beneath her. At one point, she told the nurse that some husbands struggle with belief and need scientific reassurance. The nurse did not react much to that comment, but I noticed the look she gave me. Once everything was done, we were told the results would take about a week. That week was strange. Rachel behaved like someone who had already won an argument. She told her church group that God was about to prove something important to our family. She even started talking about baby names. I did not challenge any of it. There is no point arguing about facts before the evidence arrives. So I kept driving my routes, came home in the evenings, and waited for the email from the clinic. 7 days later, it finally arrived. I opened it while sitting alone in my truck during my lunch break. The result was only one sentence long. Probability of paternity, 0%. I read the result 3 times just to make sure I was not misunderstanding something. Probability of paternity 0%. Not low, not unlikely, 0. The report also included a short explanation that the tested male could be excluded as the biological father with complete certainty based on the genetic markers. In other words, the same thing the doctor had already told me years earlier in a different way. I sat in my truck for about 10 minutes after reading it. Not because I was shocked. Honestly, the result was exactly what I expected. The only real question left was how Rachel planned to explain it. When I got home that evening, she was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone. She looked up immediately and asked if the results had arrived yet. The tone in her voice was confident, almost excited. I told her yes. Then I handed her my phone. She read the screen for about 5 seconds. Her expression changed slowly, like someone realizing they had walked into the wrong room. The confidence disappeared first, then the irritation. Finally, she handed the phone back and shrugged. Her explanation came out almost immediately. The test must be wrong. According to Rachel, science is imperfect and laboratories make mistakes all the time. She said the only reason the result looked bad was because people rely too much on human technology instead of trusting God. I asked her a very simple question. If the test is wrong, why did you agree to take it so easily? Rachel rolled her eyes like I was being difficult again. She said she assumed the results would show I was the father and finally shut down my doubts. Then she added something else. Maybe God is testing us. That was the moment I realized Rachel was not going to admit anything. Not today, maybe not ever. But I also realized something else. The test result was not just information for me. It was proof. And proof can be very useful depending on who else sees it. I did not start yelling. I did not throw anything or turn it into some dramatic scene. I simply sat down across from Rachel and looked at her for a moment while she continued scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. Then I told her we needed to talk about something practical. Our apartment. Rachel immediately rolled her eyes again like she already knew what I was about to say, and and did not feel like participating. She started repeating the same argument about the lab being wrong and about faith being stronger than science. At that point, I stopped her. I told her I was not debating the test anymore. The result was clear, and the situation was simple. She was pregnant with someone else's child. Rachel snapped back immediately. She said I was accusing her again and that I should be ashamed of doubting my own wife. Then she repeated the miracle explanation one more time. That was when I stood up. I told her something very calmly. The lease for the apartment is in my name. I signed it before we were married because at the time she was moving between jobs at different salons. Legally speaking, it is my place. Rachel stopped talking at that point. I continued explaining the situation as simply as possible. If she wanted to keep pretending this pregnancy was divine intervention, she was free to do that. But she would be doing it somewhere else. Because I was not going to live in the same apartment with someone carrying another man's baby while insisting it was a miracle. Rachel stared at me like she had not expected the conversation to go this direction. Then the insults started. She called me spiritually broken. She said I was throwing away a blessing because of my arrogance. According to her, I would regret turning my back on God. I did not respond to any of that. I just told her she needed to pack a bag and find somewhere else to stay tonight. Because the conversation was over. And for the first time since the pregnancy announcement, Rachel looked genuinely nervous. Rachel did not expect the conversation to end the way it did. At first, she tried the usual tactics. The insults came quickly. She said I was spiritually broken and arrogant. According to her, I was rejecting a blessing because my faith was weak. I did not react to any of that. I simply repeated the same thing. The test result was clear. She was carrying someone else's child. Rachel stood there for a moment like she was deciding which version of the story to use next. Then the anger faded and the performance started. Her voice got louder and she began crying, talking about how I was abandoning my own family. The problem for her was simple. Crying does not change paperwork. I walked to the kitchen counter, opened my phone again, and pulled up the test results. Then I set the phone on the table so she could see it one more time. 0%. I told her something calmly. She did not have to confess anything to me if she did not want to. She was free to keep telling people the miracle story if that made her feel better. But she was not going to do it while living in my apartment. The lease had been signed in my name years before we got married, when she was moving between salons and did not have stable income. Legally speaking, the place was mine. Rachel stopped crying immediately after I said that. For a few seconds, she just stared at me. Then the anger came back twice as strong. She said I would regret turning my back on God. She said people from church would hear about how cruel I was to a pregnant woman. I shrugged and told her she could tell them whatever story she wanted. Facts are still facts. Rachel stood there breathing hard for another minute. Then she finally grabbed her phone and stormed into the bedroom. I could hear drawers opening and bags being thrown around. About 20 minutes later, she walked out carrying 2 suitcases and a backpack. She did not say goodbye. She just looked at me one last time like I had somehow ruined her plan. Then she walked out the door. And that was the moment things actually started getting interesting. The first thing I did the next morning was block Rachel. Not out of anger. Just practicality. Rachel has a habit of turning every conversation into a long argument that goes in circles for hours. At that point, there was nothing left to debate. The paternity result already answered the only question that mattered. So before I even got out of bed, I opened my phone and blocked her number. Then I blocked her on the 2 social media apps we both used. It was not some emotional decision. It was just removing unnecessary noise from the situation. I figured the rest could be handled through lawyers later if it became necessary. About an hour later, my phone started ringing anyway. Different numbers. Unknown numbers. When I finally checked the messages, I realized what had happened. Rachel had spent the night telling her church group a very dramatic story. According to several voicemails I received, I had thrown my pregnant wife out of the apartment because I refused to accept the miracle God had given us. One message told me I should be ashamed of myself. Another suggested I needed spiritual counseling before I destroyed my family. That told me something important immediately. Rachel had clearly left out one very specific detail. The paternity test. Instead of getting angry, I handled it the simplest way possible. I opened the email from the clinic and downloaded the lab report again. Then I replied to the group message where most of the accusations were coming from. The message I sent was short and neutral. I attached the report and wrote a single explanation. Rachel and I completed a prenatal paternity test last week at the clinic together. I am medically infertile, and the probability of paternity is 0%. Then I muted the conversation. Within about 15 minutes, my phone started lighting up again. But the tone of the messages was very different this time. Because stories about miracles tend to collapse quickly once documents start circulating. The responses from Rachel's church group slowed down within an hour. Some people stopped replying completely. A few sent short messages saying they did not realize the situation was more complicated than Rachel described. One person even apologized for calling me earlier. That told me everything I needed to know. Rachel had definitely left out the paternity test when she told her version of the story. Once the report started circulating, the miracle narrative became much harder to defend. I did not keep arguing with anyone after that. There was no reason to. The document spoke for itself, and I had already said everything necessary. For the rest of the day, I focused on practical things. I contacted the apartment manager and explained that my wife had moved out and would not be returning. Since the lease had always been under my name, the conversation was simple. They just noted the update in their records. Then I started gathering paperwork. The infertility diagnosis from years ago, the paternity test result, our marriage documents. If Rachel decided to fight the divorce later, I wanted everything organized in advance. Around the evening, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a number I recognized. Rachel's sister. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. Her sister sounded exhausted when she spoke. She told me Rachel had shown up at their parents' house earlier that day, and the situation had turned into a massive argument. Apparently, the church group had already started asking Rachel questions after seeing the report, and Rachel did not have a good answer. Her sister asked me one thing. Was the test real? I told her yes. There was a long silence on the line after that. Then she quietly said that Rachel had ruined her own life. I told her that was not really my decision to make anymore, because as far as I was concerned, the situation had already been settled. The divorce process itself ended up being much simpler than people might expect. Rachel tried contacting me a few times through different numbers during the following week, but I did not respond. At that point, there was nothing left to discuss directly. Communication could happen through attorneys if necessary. Once the paperwork was filed, the situation moved quickly. The paternity test removed the only complicated question that might have existed. The child was not mine, and the medical records already confirmed my infertility from years earlier. There was no realistic way to argue around those facts. Rachel also did not have the apartment to return to since she had already moved out. The lease remained in my name, and the building manager had everything documented. From what I heard later through her sister, things did not go well for Rachel socially either. The church group that had originally defended her started distancing themselves once the report circulated. Apparently, several people felt manipulated after realizing they had been used to pressure me without knowing the full story. Her parents were also not thrilled about the situation, especially once they realized the miracle explanation did not survive basic medical testing. I never found out who the actual father was. At some point, I realized it did not matter. About 4 months after everything started, the divorce was finalized. Rachel and I have not spoken since. Life returned to something close to normal after that. I still drive the same delivery routes around Washington. I still come home to the same apartment in the evening. The difference now is that the place is quiet again. Looking back at the situation, the strange part is how simple the solution actually was. Rachel believed faith could override reality. All it really took to unravel the entire story was one lab report and the willingness to show it to the right people. Sometimes the truth does not require a big confrontation. Sometimes it just needs documentation. Bye-bye.